Welcome back to Conversations on Communism. Since the last episode, when we were talking to Colin Chambers about communism and culture in the 1960s and 70s, we've been doing a little digging into the life and works of the Australian-born British communist poet Jack Lindsay. Just to give you a flavour of his writing, here's the poet Caroline Bird reading Jack's poem In the Wild Surf.
The billow arches and turns in a cavern of tumbling gold. Arch your young back and ride, gaily trustful and bold, the curve of the elements in a shared strength and pride. There by the green dark rocks, as the tide ebbs out, there swings the undertow, ever more near. How warn you of cruel things, when the heart needs confidence? Must I sow suspicion and fear? I see your uplifted face in the hurrying light of the wave. Akin to the wildness, you go. That's the one comfort I find. I can do nothing to save, counsel, or tell what I know. Out of one depth curls the wave. From another, you rise up clear, and meet the bright dangerous day. Cut off on the barren sand, I can only love you from here, where the wind blows my words away.
In the Wild Surf was inspired by Jack's daughter Helen Lindsay, who as a child in the poem was swimming in the sea just off St Ives in Cornwall. I managed to track down the grown-up Helen, and we met up one rainy afternoon to talk about her father in a busy coffee shop in Greenwich.
I mean, the thing about Jack was he was incredibly loyal. I think he believed that you would struggle and work and talk and engage, you know, whatever his troubles with the party, and they did exist, or always really. I think his method was just to go his own way. One of the interesting things about the MI5 files is there's an awful lot of criticism of Jack in the telephone calls that go on between people in King Street, and they're sort of complaining about this and that. And there's one where he's a terrible organiser and he was treasurer of some group and he wasn't doing it properly, and I was thinking, yeah, I'm not surprised, because he would have been absolutely rotten at all that sort of thing. He just did his own thing. He wasn't an organiser, he wasn't that sort of a political activist. His method of dealing with a subject was to write a book about it. So when he and my brother used to argue a lot about politics, and then Jack wrote Crisis in Marxism.
Crisis in Marxism was published in 1981, and in it, Lindsay writes about the Marxist tradition in the 20th century, discussing such revisionists of Marx's thought as George Lukács and Antonio Gramsci. In particular, he takes issue with the jargonistic language and ideological abstraction of the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser and his fellow structuralists. He believed that their work was symptomatic of a heightened level of alienation, which he, following Marx, understood as the estrangement of people from their human essence. This estrangement, or alienation, was perceived by both Lindsay and Marx as a natural consequence of life in a society divided along class lines. But Jack did not only write scholarly works of this type. In fact, the bulk of his writings are novels, often historical fiction, and then of course his many translations of the Greek and Roman classics. He was an extraordinarily versatile writer and a gifted linguist. Although Helen tells me his spoken Russian was not so strong, he was an extremely sensitive reader of the language, and in the 1950s he produced 2 anthologies of Soviet poetry in English verse. During the Cold War, Lindsay was something of a cultural go-between. His was a voice that defied the Iron Curtain. Not only did he translate modern Russian poetry, but he also reported back to Britain the latest news from the Soviet Writers' Union. In 1968, the Soviet government even acknowledged his cultural work with the award of the Znak Почёта, the Badge of Honour.
I sent it to Australia with his other stuff,
Oh wow.
we had a
Okay, so it's in Australia, the badge of honour.
The actual one's there, yes. It's
That
in
was
the
very good of
University
you.
Technology. Well, I thought, if I leave it at home and I'll lose it or something.
Before we met, Helen had told me about a trip she remembered going on as a small child to the Soviet Union. She also mentioned something about a mysterious Russian bank account.
It was 1969 that we went, and we went because there was a lot of money in the bank account, and it was a way of spending it. And I think because of course you couldn't take money out of the Soviet Union, and so they offered us. Jack didn't want to buy anything, because he wasn't interested in buying anything. I think he already had a camera, a Russian camera. I think we had several Russian cameras. But and so we had a holiday. We had nearly 6 weeks.
This is money that he'd earned.
Absolutely. It was
From book sales.
book sales. Yeah.
This is a thing that I don't think many people know, and I certainly didn't know until quite recently, is that obviously if you think of how big the Soviet Union was, and also the emphasis on improving literacy and cultural activity being pushed, then there's a huge market for books. Jack was selling a lot of books.
He was, absolutely. And there was a private eye joke that he was the biggest selling author in Outer Mongolia.
Is that true?
Yes.
Oh wow, I've got to find this.
Yeah, no, I'm not quite sure when that was. I do remember him telling a story of how he took a taxi and for some reason the taxi driver worked out his name and said, "Oh yes, I've read your books." All right, whatever. And that was his way of saying, even the taxi drivers are literate and interested in reading and would actually be pleased to be driving around a foreign author, because we flew from Moscow to Garigo, or near Garigo anyway, because we did stay in a writer's hotel in the Black Sea for about a month. He always worked. I mean, he took his typewriter with him and he worked wherever he went. So for him, it was a trip, and we went, but he'd be there typing away. I mean, he was available. You could go and talk to him, but it was like, well, why would you? Because he's doing that, and so you'd be off doing something else. So he wasn't, he was just very focused, and he always said that he never learned to drive because he'd crash straight away because he'd be thinking of something else. So his mind was just very in that. I mean, you write, you know what it's like. You go into that state, don't you? Of the place where you are, or where you're writing, what you're writing about.
It takes about 45 minutes or 2 pints in quick succession to kind of break out of the day's writing.
Yes, absolutely. You can be in a weird daze. Well, I think he was in that sort of stage a lot of the time. It was all happening, and the stories were going, or the ideas were shifting, and so when he talked to us, it was only half there.
Did you ever meet your grandfather Norman?
No. So Norman left the family, and Jack would have been about 7 or 8, I think, and he was the eldest. He had 2 younger brothers, and their mother went up to Brisbane to where her sisters were, and I think Jack had an absent father thing, so he had this famous father who he didn't see for at least more than 10 years, who he knew was famous, and and then I think wanted his admiration and interest, and I think it took him years to get over that. So
Jack's relationship with his father, the famous Australian artist Norman Lindsay, was strained to say the least. There is a deep and matter-of-fact sorrow in Jack when it came to his father. This is well captured in his poem To My Father, Norman, Alone in the Blue Mountains, here read by the poet Hannah Silver.
Though you, in your hermitage of cold and scornful stone, of tranquil and ruthless light, refuse to accept these pages, what other name can I write over the arch of the ruin made my sole monument? Your rejecting word I ignore and call up your name once more, though you will pay no heed, though you will never read these words in your mountain lair. So long for you alone I wrote, all my thoughts I bent on you as friend and foe so long, no name I know but yours for this empty space. Now Ray and Phil are both gone, and the spiralling fury of time bores remorselessly on. As a bitter tribute then, take these pages that strip me bare in death's thin, bleakening ray. Turn for a moment, I say, turn from your obdurate place in that clarity of stone, that terrible folly of light. Turn for a moment this way, your abstracted face.
Jack collected quite a lot of art. I mean, he bought a Picasso. You know, when he had no money, he still bought pictures in the 30s, and he also bought lots and lots of classical pottery. And he had a huge collection.
He had a collection of classical pottery.
Absolutely massive.
What kinds?
Anything.
Did you ever knock any over when you?
No, they were all stored away in his study in great piles.
Greek pots with the mythic figures on and
absolutely, yes. Egyptian little mummies and little figures, and then quite big pots, sort of Minoan, and I think Roman. I mean, I think he would just get what he could afford.
I've heard about his library. Colin Chambers told me that because I think he'd visited a few times, and he said, yeah, when you went to his house, there's this enormous library with more books than you could.
Absolutely everywhere, apart from the bathroom. Father had 4 major relations. For a quiet man, he did quite well with women. So he had 4 major relationships in his life. My mother was really the last. But Anne, who died, really they bought the house together in Essex, and it was a sort of single story mainly. It had one room halfway off the stairs and another room at the top, but the rest of it was quite flat. And he just put books up everywhere, and none of it was proper. It was all sort of, because there was a lot of beams, and then he just nail a few supports in and put some shelves, and there'd be more books on, and so that it just, you could see that it had just grown. You know, they went all the way down the hall. They were in the living room, in his study, in the bedrooms, and they were floor to ceiling. They were really, really everywhere. I had a sudden memory about a week ago. I think it must have been, you know, going around in the back of my head that I was coming to meet you, about when I was at primary school, and I used to have this game about Greek goddesses, and I organised my peers. I think it must have been only girls. I can't imagine it would have been any boys. Into gods and goddesses, and made them all into Hera and Zeus, not Zeus, but Aphrodite, and sort of Artemis, and and so he must. I mean, I must have got that from Jack, obviously. I mean, I don't know. I don't remember him specifically talking to us, but I think he must have told us those stories.
Aside from the Greek and Roman myths, another lurking presence in the Lindsay household came in the somewhat shady form of the British Secret Service. For decades they kept tabs on Jack, and in so doing produced reams and reams of official documentation on his activities. As tactfully as I could, I asked Helen that awkward question. Was your dad a spy?
Well, I don't think there would have been any point, because he wouldn't have had anything to tell them, Yeah, of course it's crossed my mind, but wouldn't have been in his nature. It's not that he wasn't secretive, he was a bit secretive, but not in a way that was unethical, if you like. He was deeply, deeply ethical. Yeah, I mean, I have wondered about it because particularly, even if you look at the number of files on Jack, there's a lot of paperwork, and you think, oh, for God's sake, what's the point? But actually, I think there was a point, and I think, as I said to you in the email, I think, a lot of it was around tracking people so they could find out about other people, and it does say that in one bit of the files, because we had our post open for years, decades, and there is just a little note which is a justification, because every so often they would have to, special branch I think it was, would have to say why they were still asking to have the post stopped, and it says something like, this post thing has been revealing of a number of other sources and is interesting because it allows us to see, what's going on in other groups. So I think it was that. And they did, so there were a number of people that Jack did correspond with who may have had some spying, because that's how they found people. So they initially made contact with Jack, or he became known to them, if you like, because he wrote to Tom Whittringer, who was known to them for his activities. So it was all sort of everybody linking to everybody else. I believe that it was also because they were constantly on the lookout for people they could turn, if you like. So somebody like Spender was incredibly useful to them because he represented somebody who supposedly had been left-wing and now didn't really believe. And I think that's a far more powerful message out there in the world to people. Oh yeah, I've been through all that, but of course it's all rubbish, and now I've seen the light. And I think they were constantly on the lookout for people who could be manipulated, used, whatever, in that way, helped. So they would support people. It might not be direct, but they could just, gently support. But also, I think there are an awful lot of informants. So, those two strands really. Would you inform in your fellow left-wingers? Yeah. Or would you actually, are you going to sort of just shift publicly rightwards, and they sort of they would help you along the way, and I think both those things happened.
What they also might have been doing is perhaps if you just gently apply pressure, you make someone aware that you're watching them, and you make them, they obviously know why they're being watched, and then maybe they start to curb their behaviours.
Yes.
That's one way, and then another is that in fact, so it's kind of like a kind of bullying presence.
Self-censorship.
In your article, actually, was that brilliant letter which says nothing at all.
Absolutely, the BBC. No, it doesn't. It just, we're informing you.
We are informing you that Jack Lindsay is known to us as being a communist.
Yes.
And we have been informed that he has written a show for you or something.
Yes.
And then yours sincerely.
Absolutely. It's fantastically nothing. I mean, I'm loath to use the word establishment because it's been so ill-used these days. But I think in its older and truer sense, the British establishment, I think that's how they functioned. They functioned without having to say. Everybody knew what everybody meant. So you didn't need to say it outright.
Just you exert your silent power.
Absolutely. It's incredibly effective. Absolutely, and ruthless as well. Because it knows exactly where its interests are. In the era that Jack was under surveillance, the Secret Service wasn't acknowledged as existing. And because it wasn't acknowledged as existing, it could not be held under any legal powers. In many ways, he was ahead of his time. He was vegetarian since the 30s, and although he had strains of, generational maleness, if you like, he was more of a feminist than many men are these days. But I think he had a very deep sense of equality.
Thank you for listening to Conversations on Communism. Next episode, my co-host Dr. Eleanor Taylor will be back, and we'll both be talking with Professor Richard Seaford and Dr. Ben Harker about the communist classical scholar George Thomson.